No one expected anybody to touch the cut Parker Schnabel walked away from mid-season, the one he flat out called geologically unstable before abandoning it without a second glance. In the Yukon, a warning like that is practically a death sentence. If Parker quits, everyone assumes the ground is cursed, dead, or waiting to collapse on whoever's foolish enough to try again. But when Rick Ness rolled back into Dawson with a tiny crew and nothing but a point to prove, that abandoned pit was the first place he drove to. He climbed out of his truck, stared down at the half-collapsed walls and the frozen mud ridges Parker left behind, and said nothing. He just studied it like the ground was keeping a secret. Parker never noticed. Local miners spotted him standing there and started whispering before he even fired up a machine. "He's wasting his comeback on a graveyard," one muttered. "Nothing left but headaches," said another. Everyone agreed on one thing. Rick was taking the worst possible gamble at the worst possible time. But Rick didn't hear any of it. He had something no one else had. Fresh drone scans from a friend who owed him a favor. And those scans revealed something strange. Long hairline fractures running through the permafrost beneath Parker's pit fractures that didn't match normal freeze patterns. Something had disturbed that ground long ago, something no one had investigated. Rick didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew what he had to do. He staked the claim anyway, tossed the paperwork onto his dashboard, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Parker walked away too soon." The next morning, Rick started cleaning out the pile of old equipment Parker left behind. Rusted hoses, bent track pads, a fuel tank that would never hold fuel again. Under a collapsed wooden pallet, he found something that didn't belong there. A crumpled, sun-bleached survey map covered in blue grease pencil markings. Clearly from Parker's season, but it wasn't any map Parker ever talked about. This one had a hand-drawn circle labeled "Test Later," pointing toward a narrow channel stretching far to the east, an area Parker never drilled, never mentioned, never tested. Rick spread the map across the hood of his loader and stared at it. When he called over his geologist, the man scanned the numbers along the margins and frowned. The readings didn't match Parker's final report at all. Not even close. Parker's data claimed the ground past a certain point was dead and flat, but this map hinted at a second pay streak deeper down. A streak Parker's team must have dismissed because their surface tests didn't match the deeper measurements. For the first time, Rick allowed himself a bold thought. What if Parker's scanners glitched? What if his crew labeled good ground as worthless because their equipment misread the signal? It didn't happen often, but it wasn't impossible. And if that's what happened, the richest untouched channel on the entire claim might still be lying right under their boots. Rick didn't say a word, but his eyes said plenty. He folded the map, sealed it in a plastic sleeve, and told his crew to prep the excavator. Now the question wasn't whether there was gold. It was whether they could reach it before anyone else figured out what Rick had discovered. The first test pit was small, just a sample hole to see if the map's predictions were real. The excavator dropped its bucket, scooped up frozen dirt, and dumped it into the shaker. Rick leaned in as the first wash ran through. What came out made his stomach twist. Instead of the fine drift gold Parker found all season, the mats caught heavy, dark, coarse gold. The kind that forms deep beneath ancient slides. The kind hidden under decades of frozen overburden. Rick's geologist ran the numbers twice. Then again, triple Parker's best readings. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one wanted to jinx it. But the look on Rick's face wasn't excitement. It was something far deeper. It was the confirmation Rick needed. This wasn't a lucky pocket or a leftover scrap Parker overlooked. It was proof that something big was sitting beneath a layer Parker never reached, ground that had slid long before Parker ever worked it. And then came the real shocker. The sample layer was buried beneath collapsed overburden from an old slide, meaning the gold had been completely invisible to Parker's tests. It had been sealed under frozen debris, impossible to detect unless someone dug far deeper than the original cut allowed. And on his very first test pit, Rick had punched straight through it by accident. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for sunrise, investors, or anyone's approval. He ordered the crew to expand the pit immediately, wider, deeper, tearing back everything Parker left behind. Because if this matched what the map hinted at, it wasn't just a promising sign. It was the beginning of something Parker had walked away from without realizing what he left buried. As the machines roared to life, Rick's only real worry wasn't whether there was gold. It was whether they could keep the discovery quiet long enough to uncover what the ground was hiding next. They didn't even get through the first expanded cut before the ground answered back. About 15 feet down, the excavator bucket slammed to a complete stop, as if it had struck steel. The operator tried again, same resistance. It wasn't rock, and it wasn't frozen gravel. It was something solid, smooth, and unmistakably shaped. He radioed Rick immediately. Rick arrived half awake, expecting to see hardpan. But the moment he noticed the straight edges buried in the ice, he froze. Whatever they had hit wasn't natural. They blasted the area with heaters, ice melting away in sheets until the full shape emerged. Ancient timber cribbing, the kind Yukon miners used nearly a century ago for hand-cut drift tunnels under frozen ground. Nobody expected anything like that beneath Parker's claim. The beams were worn and splintered, half swallowed by permafrost, but unmistakably man-made. Someone had dug here long before Parker ever touched the place, and they had clearly stopped too early. Rick crouched beside the exposed wood, brushing frost from the joints. The angle of the cribbing pointed downward beneath Parker's abandoned cut. There was only one explanation: a collapsed drift shaft. And drift shafts only existed when old-timers believed something valuable lay deeper. Usually a promising pay channel they couldn't reach with the tools of their time. Rick knew the history. Miners back then shut down operations for 1,000 reasons: war, lack of money, early freezes, or ground too dangerous to continue. But they didn't dig shafts unless they had seen color. Real color. The crew cleared more overburden, exposing the tunnel mouth, long sealed by decades of slides. The more they uncovered, the stranger it became. The tunnel wasn't on any map. Parker's geological reports had zero mention of historic workings. Either he never scanned deep enough, or the drift had been buried so long, the sensors mistook it for natural ice layers. But now that it was exposed, Rick understood. Someone had been close to finding something huge, and the ground had beaten them before they reached it. Rick decided to enter the drift himself. It wasn't safe. Every warning from the geologist said they needed to reinforce it first, but time wasn't on their side. Once word got out that cribbing had been found, half the valley would be sniffing around the claim. Rick ducked under the timber and stepped into the frozen tunnel, his breath echoing against the narrow walls. The air was stale and metallic. Fragments of old carbide lamps littered the floor. Rusted picks leaned against the walls, and a crushed tin mug sat exactly where someone had dropped it 70 or 80 years ago. It felt like stepping into a moment suspended in time. At the far end of the drift, Rick's headlamp caught something the old miners never reached. A streak of black sand-packed gravel cut a clean diagonal through the drift wall, dense, heavy, and completely untouched. Black sand veins were always a good sign, but this one was different. It was layered so tightly and so rich that it shimmered even without water. Rick scraped a sample into a pan, carried it outside, and quietly washed it while the crew looked on. When the gold meter shot far past the normal range, the geologist turned to Rick like he'd just uncovered a motherlode. This wasn't ordinary alluvial gold. This was deep channel, high-grade purity. Rick didn't shout, didn't grab cameras, didn't celebrate. He simply marked the wall with an orange stripe and muttered under his breath, "This is the channel Parker missed." Back on the surface, the crew immediately began running geoscans along the old drift line. If the black sand vein was part of a bigger pattern, they needed to know where it led. The scanners pinged hard, too hard. A bright seam lit up beneath Parker's old cut, running parallel to the ground he had worked all season. But this seam didn't stop where Parker's pay had ended. It veered sharply, diving deeper beneath the southeast ridge. That bend made it nearly impossible to detect with traditional surface testing, which explained why Parker's readings flatlined and why Rick's new samples didn't match any historical data. The ground was hiding a fully intact pay channel nearly 200 meters long. The geologist walked Rick through the overlay. The channel widened as it dipped southeast, expanding the farther it stretched, and that widening meant two things: untouched gravels and multi-season potential. Possibly enough to fund years of mining without setting foot on new ground. It was the kind of geological jackpot most miners spend their entire lives searching for. One only discovered by luck, instinct, or a forgotten old map. Rick stood on the ridge at sunrise, staring at the scanner output in disbelief. Parker had dug within 10 meters of this channel, without ever realizing what was just out of reach. One set of mislabeled core samples, one misread scanner, one buried drift shaft. Those tiny mistakes had blinded him to the biggest opportunity of his season. And now Rick was standing on a find that could redefine his entire comeback. The news didn't spread officially, not yet, but miners talk, suppliers talk. Investors always catch whispers before anyone else. Rick's phone buzzed all morning, blocked numbers, private equity groups, old partners he hadn't heard from in years, all wanting to meet. They didn't know the details, but they knew the mood in the valley. Whenever a miner uncovers historical cribbing tied to fresh pay readings, it usually means something legendary has awakened underground. Rick ignored every call. Down in the pit, the crew widened the drift access, braced the walls, and prepped to chase the channel wherever it went. The air felt different. The ground felt different. Even the machines seemed to move with more urgency, like everyone understood they were working above something massive. Something that had been waiting nearly a century to be uncovered. Rick knew this wasn't just about a comeback season anymore. It wasn't about proving critics wrong. This was about revealing the truth beneath ground Parker had abandoned. Without realizing, he'd walked away from the biggest discovery of his career. As the scanning team marked the next dig line along the southeast bend, Rick understood they were only beginning to grasp just how deep this channel ran. But before the crew could cut the next line, the ground made the first move. A sharp, rolling crack tore across the bend, the kind of sound a miner hears once and never forgets. The southeast wall, already weakened by years of freeze-thaw cycles, gave way in one violent shudder. Dirt and ice crashed down, and the crew retreated fast. When the dust finally settled, no one saw the collapse as a setback. Rick stared at the opening carved into the fallen wall. A hollowed-out chamber that absolutely should not have existed in ground Parker had already worked. The cave-in hadn't just taken down the face. It had ripped open an entrance into a sealed pocket the scanners had completely missed. Rick stepped to the edge, peering into what looked like a hidden cavern filled with untouched pay. The walls were lined with reddish gravels, the kind that only form when water once pushed through a narrow, pressurized space. No one had mined it. No one had even reached it. This wasn't leftover debris. This was untouched ground, preserved beneath a natural dome of permafrost, and Clay Parker never even knew it was there. His machines had stopped just meters above it, cutting only the edges while the real treasure slept directly below. Rick called for buckets to be lowered, and the moment they scraped the exposed layer, everyone watching fell silent. The gravels clinked. Heavy, dense, nothing like the soft rattle of fine alluvial gold. This was nugget country, the kind of pay that forms in trap zones. Rare pockets where flowing water slows just enough to drop the heaviest gold in the same spot for thousands of years. When the excavator lifted the first full scoop into daylight, a flash of yellow caught Rick's eye. He walked forward, reached into the gravel, and pulled out a nugget so big the crew froze. It wasn't just large. It was historic. Nearly a pound, shaped by centuries of pressure and water flow. This was the kind of gold Parker spent entire seasons chasing and never found. The kind museums want and investors fight over. It confirmed instantly that the chamber was a massive trap zone, one the old drift miners never reached, and one Parker unknowingly dug right beside without ever touching. As more samples came up, every pan glowed with oversized gold, chunky, water-worn, dense. No miner alive walks away from ground like that. What should have cost Rick days of cleanup had instead exposed the richest hidden pocket in the entire cut. And the deeper Rick looked into that void, the clearer the truth became. The ground hadn't failed Parker. Parker's data had failed him. Back in the office trailer, Rick sat with his foreman, who had just received archived core logs from one of Parker's old suppliers. Getting them wasn't easy. Most miners protect their logs like treasure maps, but these were duplicate logs filed for warranty issues, and the supplier sent them assuming they were worthless. Rick spread them across the table, placing his corrected samples beside them. At first, nothing looked unusual, just normal Yukon variations. But then something strange jumped out. The depth markers on Parker's logs didn't match the real ground, not even close. A 2-meter clay layer was labeled as silt. A gravel zone listed in Parker's records didn't appear at all in the actual cut. The more Rick compared, the more obvious it became. Parker's core samples had been mislabeled during the season. Wrong depths, wrong layers, wrong pay markers. One clerical mistake, one wrong sticker on a column of drilled earth, had convinced Parker the lower ground held nothing. His logs showed dead readings, but Rick's corrected tests showed values nearly 40 times higher. 40 times. Enough to completely change a season plan. Enough to turn a failing cut into the kind of discovery miners spend their entire careers dreaming about. Rick leaned back, stunned. Parker hadn't walked away because the ground was worthless. He walked away because the numbers lied to him. The richest parts of the claim had been labeled barren. The heavy gold pockets were tagged as clay. The true depth of the pay channel, especially the southeast bend, was completely misclassified. And that tiny mistake explained everything. It all finally made sense. Why Parker's scans never picked up the pay streak, why the old drift shaft lined up perfectly with Rick's current gold line, and why the trap zone stayed hidden until the wall collapsed. No one had ever drilled the true gold line. For decades it had been sitting there, untouched and unnoticed beneath layers of mislabeled ground. Armed with the corrected logs, Rick ordered deeper digging along the southeast vector. The machines chewed through frozen layers until the soil suddenly softened. Too quickly. The excavator dipped, lurched, and a surge of water burst upward from below. They had broken into an underground pocket, a buried reservoir sealed under centuries of compressed earth. Pumps were hauled in immediately as the pit flooded with icy water. When the last of the murky water cleared, what emerged stunned every miner on site. A cavern stretched beneath the cut, a huge bowl-shaped chamber filled with tightly compacted ancient gravels. These weren't ordinary gravels. They were the kind found only in glacial outflow zones, places where torrents of water once blasted through rock, carrying massive amounts of gold before slowing enough to drop the heaviest pieces. These layers weren't loose either. They were cemented together, each stratum representing thousands of years of deposition. Rick climbed down with a sampler and dug into the gravel with a spade. Even without washing it, the weight told the story. Black sands filled the gaps between stones. Small nuggets were visible before the pan even touched water. When they ran the first test load through the wash plant, the mats didn't just catch gold. They overflowed with it. Gold stacked deep in every riffle, packed so thick it looked like carpet gold spilled over the edges. Rick didn't need to speak. The crew already knew what they had found. The cavern wasn't just rich, it was enormous. The kind of find that becomes legend. Someone whispered, "This is the $1 million chamber," and the name stuck instantly. The actual value didn't matter. It could easily surpass $1 million. What mattered was how fast the gold added up, how unreal it felt, how impossible it was to believe Parker Schnabel had worked this exact ground for an entire season without ever knowing what was buried beneath him. Rick stared into the cavern, watching water drip from the ceiling onto gravels older than any mine in the valley. Beneath all the mistakes, the collapsed walls, the forgotten drift, the bad data, and the frozen layers, this is what had been waiting. A secret sealed by time, missed by chance, uncovered by a miner who refused to believe the ground was finished speaking, and the chamber was only the beginning. The channel feeding it continued deeper, much deeper. The age of the gravel bothered Rick. It didn't match any recorded workings in the area, which meant someone had been digging here long before any modern operation touched this land. So he gathered every scrap of historical documentation he could find, searching for anyone who might have known about this deeper channel before time buried it. That search led him to old government archive files, maps no one bothered to check because the land was assumed to be completely worked out. Spread across the hood of his pickup, those faded pencil sketches revealed a story no modern miner had seen. A secret mining syndicate operating here in the 1930s. A private group that filed no reports and kept all results hidden. Notes in the margins explained everything. Their project shut down overnight when wartime resource seizures hit the Yukon. They sealed their shafts, removed their equipment, and vanished, leaving their richest prospects unfinished. Now those abandoned tunnels, drawn shakily on brittle paper, lined up almost perfectly with Rick's newest and deepest geological readings. As the crew dug deeper along the newly exposed drift connection, the excavator pulled up chunks of hardened muck that didn't belong there. Embedded in the frozen dirt were rusted blasting caps, ancient fuses, and fragments of powder boxes stamped with logos no miner on the crew had ever seen. Rick held one of the blasting caps in his glove, staring at it like it was a message straight from the past. The old syndicate hadn't just explored this ground, they had started working it in earnest. They had been chasing the same direction Rick was now following. They were only inches away from the very channel he had uncovered. But time, war, and circumstance forced them to abandon everything before they reached the final layer. All these years, the richest gold on Parker's claim hadn't been overlooked because nobody searched for it. It had been missed because history intervened and shut the door just before anyone reached the prize. Rick felt the weight of that discovery. He wasn't simply mining. He was finishing a story that men decades before him never got the chance to complete. Then the next scan came in. One of those readings so unbelievable, it makes a geologist question whether the machine is broken. Ground-penetrating radar showed a perfectly preserved geological feature beneath the million-dollar chamber, an ancient riverbed fossilized under thousands of years of ice and sediment. Ancient riverbeds are the holy grail of the Yukon, the birthplace of some of the largest nuggets ever recorded. They form when glacial meltwater cuts through deep channels, hauling huge amounts of heavy gold before suddenly freezing or drying up, sealing the treasure permanently in place. This one ran directly beneath the land Parker had given up on. Rick climbed down as the crew carved the first access path to the riverbed layer. The material they pulled up didn't look like normal gravels. It was dark, heavy, and streaked with mineral veins so dense they almost shone like metal nuggets appeared immediately. Thick, flattened pieces shaped by water pressure older than any mining operation in the region. When Rick filled his first pan, the gold didn't just gleam. It burned bright under the Yukon sun dents, ancient, unmistakable. The first full cleanup left even Rick speechless. The numbers were unreal. The mats overflowed. The sluice trays filled with more gold than any early season run in his career. The crew checked the totals twice, then again. Nobody wanted to say the number out loud because it sounded absurd, but the count didn't change. The ancient riverbed wasn't just rich, it was astronomical. Based on early estimates, the new channel could hold more than $110 million in recoverable gold if the reading stayed consistent. And given the width, depth, and flow behavior of the ancient channel, it was entirely possible those estimates were still low. From that moment, everything moved faster. Each cleanup beat the last. Each run confirmed the impossible. Word leaked quietly at first, then raced across Dawson like wildfire. Rick Ness, the miner everyone thought was finished, the guy who returned with a skeleton crew and a chip on his shoulder, had struck one of the richest channels in the modern Yukon. By the time the final tallies came in, the numbers were no longer rumors. They were official. Rick's season shattered every historical record the region had ever logged. Even the old syndicate's legendary numbers were dwarfed by what Rick recovered from the ancient riverbed. Miners from across the territory came just to hear the story firsthand. Investors who had ignored him months earlier were now begging for meetings. But Rick didn't celebrate publicly. He kept his head down and worked. The ground was still giving, still speaking, still revealing more with every meter they opened. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the machines idled, a familiar truck rolled onto the claim. Parker Schnabel stepped out quietly. No cameras, no crew, just a miner staring at the ground he once believed he understood better than anyone. He walked the edge of the pit, his eyes tracing the old drift shaft, the cavern, the exposed trap zone, the streaks of pure gold drying on the mats. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Parker didn't need to say a word. His silence said everything. He understood he had been only inches away from the discovery of a lifetime, and he'd walked right past it. Rick met him at the edge of the pit, watching his face as the truth settled in. When the official numbers finally spread through the valley, over $110 million recovered and still climbing, Rick didn't brag. He didn't gloat. He didn't throw a single comment back at Parker. He just held the final tally sheet in his hand and said the one line that summed up the entire story.